And I have had that interest. And you know how as you generate a specific interest, you find yourself gravitating toward persons with similar interests.
My mother used to say all the time that birds of a feather flock together. And that's often why parents say, "Why are you hanging out with those kids? They're up to no good." And when people see you with hanging out with those kids, they'll think you're up to no good as well. Another statement I used to hear back in the day, I think one of my friends said it to me, that if people of different ethnicities, maybe even shades of color, are hanging out together, that they're up to no good. I don't know where that comes from. Perhaps the person who came up with that wanted the different races of people to be up to no good. And then you can say, oh, the races shouldn't hang out together. They're just going to be up to no good in the end. Although at the Tower of Babel, when everybody got together, they were definitely up to no good. Different subject for a different day. Just some comments. I don't normally make comments without having a reason for it, but I thought there is deserving. And also, birds of a feather flock together just goes back to what Alice Bailey used to say about, the secret society schools. The people in there are fighting for the same goals, and they should be hanging out together and working towards their goals. Albert Pike called it the great work, and everybody's working together to achieve those ends, whatever those ends may be. For the great work, it's definitely the New World Order and the return, or not the return, but the appearance of the Antichrist.
And ultimately, I found myself kind of the center of the world of dissatisfaction with the direction that this country was headed. And that's on one direction. And this same way, I found myself in contact with many individuals who, on their own, had done a vast amount of studying and research.
The man conducting the interview, his name is G. Edward Griffin. He also wrote the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. I will do an epilogue at the end of the video series to show how the Federal Reserve was created, what their purpose was, and I'll also show how banks create money. All these things are very interesting, and everyone should know about them. I'll also show more from foundations, their power and influence, as Norman Dodd talks about foundations more. I'll show some pages from the book, Foundations, Their Power and Influence, just to back up a little bit of what he's saying, and then I'll do a deep dive in the epilogue.
And
Well, Mr. Dodd, if I may interrupt here for a second, at what point in your career did you become connected with the Reese Committee?
1953.
1953.
Yeah.
And what was that capacity, sir?
That was the capacity of what they call Director of Research for the Reese Committee.
Can you tell us what the Reese Committee was attempting to do?
Yes, I can tell you. It was operating and carrying out instructions embodied in a resolution passed by the House of Representatives, which was to investigate the activities of foundations as to whether or not these activities could justifiably be labeled un-American without, I might say, defining what they meant by un-American. But that was the resolution, and the committee had then the task of selecting a council, and the council in turn had the task of selecting a staff, and he had to have somebody who would direct the work of that staff. And that was what they meant by the director of research.
What were some of the details, the specifics that you told the committee at that time?
Well, Mr. Griffin, in that report, I specifically, number one, defined what was, to us, what was meant by the phrase un-American. And we defined that in our way as being a determination to effect changes in the country by unconstitutional means. We have plenty of constitutional procedures, assuming that we wish to effect a change in the form of government or that sort of thing. And therefore, any effort in that direction which did not avail itself of the procedures which were authorized by the Constitution could be justifiably called un-American. That was the start of educating them up to that particular point. The next thing was to educate them as to the effect on the country as a whole of the activities of large endowed foundations over the then past 40 years.
What was that effect, sir?
That effect was to orient our educational system away from support of the principles embodied in the Declaration of Independence and implemented in the Constitution, and educated them over to the idea that the task now was, as a result of the orientation of education, to away from these briefly stated principles and self-evident truths. And that's what had been the effect of the wealth which constituted the endowments of those foundations that had been in existence over the largest portion of the span of 50 years, and holding them responsible for this change. And what we were able to bring forward was that what we had uncovered was the determination of these large endowed foundations through their trustees to actually get control over the content of American education.
I try and make it possible for people to connect the dots in the same fashion that I did, or at least a similar fashion. This is why I started with the Leipzig connection first, was to show how education went through a change. And it went through a change starting with Wilhelm Wundt over in Germany. He taught others, like John Dewey, how to change psychology. Okay, they wanted to change psychology from psychological to physiological. Psychological meaning it's about the brain. Physiological meaning it's about the body and its senses and its reaction. All right? And in the epilogue, I'll show more of why education was corrupted. I'll do it through Foundations, Their Power and Influence, and I'll bring back more of the Leipzig connection. Here are a few pictures of those who helped reshape education and psychology in America. They have some quotations and explanations of who they are, their names and so forth, underneath the pictures. I'll bring these men back later on in the epilogue.
There's quite a bit of publicity given to your conversation with Rowan Gaither. Would you please tell us who he was and what was that conversation you had with him?
Rowan Gaither was at that time president of the Ford Foundation. And Mr. Gaither had sent for me when I found it convenient to be in New York. asked me to call upon him at his office, which I did. And on arrival, after a few amenities, Mr. Gaither said, "Mr. Dodd, we've asked you to come up here today because we thought that possibly off the record you would tell us why the Congress is interested in the activities of foundations such as ourselves." And before I could think of how I would reply to that statement, Mr. Gaither then went on voluntarily and stated, he said, "Mr. Dodd, all of us that have a hand in the making of policies here have had experience either with the OSS during the war or the European Economic Administration after the war. We've had experience operating under directives, and these directives emanate and did emanate from the White House. Now, we still operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know." Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, "Mr. Dodd, we here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union." Well, parenthetically, Mr. Griffin, I nearly fell off the chair.
I decided to use the good old Britannica dictionary for conspiracy, plural conspiracies. The first definition is a secret plan made by two or more people to do something that is harmful or illegal. The second is the act of secretly planning to do something that is harmful or illegal. All right? So now we're going to go off into what the word conspire means. Here we have daily writing tips. The Latin word for breathe inspired many English terms. The Latin verb sperare, meaning breathe, is the source of a number of verbs and other parts of speech. Here's a summary of these words and their meanings. Aspire literally means breathe on. The connotation is that one breathes heavily with the exertion of aspiring to a goal. The modern sense of aspire is try to be or do something. And the noun from aspirant refers to someone who is a candidate or contestant. To conspire, the word literally means breathe together. It's to plot or plan a scheme with others. Plotters are also called conspirators, and conspiracy is a synonym for plot. So you guys can go on and read the rest on your own. Look for daily writing tips. The Latin word for breathe inspired many English terms. So when people talk about conspiracies, it's just the idea that men have plotted together, meaning they breathed that plan together. They made a plan together. And how often do people make plans together? Conspiracy doesn't have to mean that whatever you believe is crazy about a particular circumstance, that what you believe about a circumstance should be qualified by facts, not by make-believe. For me, whatever I tend to believe that people will call a conspiracy, I just look at it as, look, it's a plan people made together. And we can't trust everyone to do good by the American public, because conspiracies are real and people do plot and plan against the people of their own nation and other people's nations as well. And I'll show more of those things in other episodes of whatever I choose to cover. But those things will be covered, such as Operation Paperclip and Operation Gladio.